Fenton's hand connected with the boy's jaw before Nell had even set her trunk down in the stable yard. The crack echoed off the stone walls of Thornfield Park like a pistol shot, sending a flock of starlings screaming from the eaves, and the boy, tall, dark-haired, his shoulders straining against a threadbare shirt, did not raise a hand, did not flinch. He stood with his boots planted in the spring mud, blood welling on his lower lip, and looked at Fenton the way a horse looks at a fence it has already decided to clear. Not with fear, with measurement. Nell dropped her trunk. She did not think. That was the problem with her. Had always been the problem, according to her late father, according to every employer who had eventually asked her to leave. She did not think before she moved. She crossed the stable yard in 4 strides, her boots squelching in the cherry blossom-littered mud, and stepped directly between the head groom and the boy he had just struck. "Touch him again," she said, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone who has rehearsed this sentence in different kitchens, different stable yards, different lives. "And I will report you to the Duke myself." Fenton was thick-set, cold-eyed. His hands were enormous, and his knuckles were scarred, and he smelled of horse sweat and authority. He looked down at Nell, at her auburn hair escaping its pins, at her mud-spattered traveling dress, at the freckles across her nose that made her look younger than her 23 years, and his mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "And who," he said softly, "are you?" "Eleanor Prescott, your new horse trainer." She did not step back. The cherry blossoms drifted between them like pink snow. "The Duke's steward hired me. I have a letter." "A letter?" Fenton's gaze moved from her to the boy behind her, then back. "The steward hires a woman to train horses. The world has gone quite mad." "The world was always mad. I simply arrived." Mel held his stare. Her heart was hammering. She could feel it in her wrists, in the thin skin at her throat. But her face gave nothing. She had learned that trick young. You could shake apart on the inside as long as your chin stayed level. Fenton stepped back. Not because she had won. She could see that in his face, in the way his jaw worked as if chewing through something he wanted to say. He stepped back because there were other grooms watching from the stable doors, and a woman with a letter from the steward was not the kind of problem you solved with your fists. Not on the first day. "Welcome to Thornfield, Miss Prescott," he said. His voice was pleasant, his eyes were not. "I do hope you last longer than the others." He turned and walked toward the main stable block, his boots striking the cobblestones with the measured authority of a man who owned every square inch he walked on. Which, Nell thought, he did not. But he believed he did. And in her experience, the leaf was more dangerous than title. She turned to the boy. He was wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, a gesture so practiced it looked automatic. Up close he was. She noticed this with the clinical detachment she applied to horses, to hoof angles and shoulder conformation. He was striking. Not handsome in the polished, drawing-room sense. Striking in the way a cliff face is striking. All hard planes and unexpected shadows. Dark hair falling across his forehead. Eyes that were grey-green, the colour of river water in early spring. Shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. Hands that were wide and calloused, and even now, even with blood on his mouth, held with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with the rest of him. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at her. Really looked. As if cataloguing her the way she had just catalogued him. Then, "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" "Stepped in. He'll remember." "Good." Nell pulled a pin from her hair, shoved it back in at a better angle, and picked up her trunk. "I have an excellent memory myself. What's your name?" A pause. He glanced toward the stable block where Fenton had disappeared. "Kit." "Just Kit?" "Just Kit." She studied him for a moment longer. The educated set of his jaw, the way he held himself like someone who had been taught to stand straight, and had never been given permission to slouch. And then she reached into the pocket of her traveling coat and produced an apple. She had stolen it from the last coaching inn. She held it out. He looked at the apple. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, or the memory of surprise, something he had trained himself not to feel. "Stolen?" he asked. "Obviously." He took it. His fingers were warm where they brushed hers, and rough, and for a fraction of a second she felt the controlled strength in them, the way you feel the current in a river when you dip your hand below the surface. "Thank you, Miss Prescott." "Now." "Thank you, now." He almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth lifted and then stopped, as if the mechanism had rusted from disuse. But almost. And Nell, who had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the Thornfield stables on her very first morning, found herself thinking that almost was a start. The spring air was warm and smelled of mud and new grass and the faint sweetness of cherry blossom. And somewhere in the paddock behind the stable block, a horse screamed. Mel's first morning as Thornfield's horse trainer began at dawn and went wrong by 7 o'clock. She was in the training ring with a bay mare who had been spooked by a harness, working the horse in slow circles, her voice low and steady, her hands gentle on the lunge line, when Fenton appeared at the rail with 3 of his grooms. "Wider circles," he called. "You're crowding her." Nell did not look up. The mare's ear flicked toward Fenton's voice, and she shied sideways, and Nell adjusted instantly. A half-step back, a loosening of the line, a murmured word that brought the mare's attention back to her. The horse settled. Nell continued. "I said wider," Fenton repeated. "And I heard you." Nell kept her voice even. The mare was trembling, her flanks dark with sweat. "She's not ready for a wider radius. She'll bolt." "She'll bolt because you're handling her like a child with a kitten." Fenton turned to the grooms. "Watch how a real trainer does it." He jerked his chin at one of them, a sandy-haired boy who looked about 16 and terrified. "Thomas, take the line." Thomas climbed the rail and reached for the lunge line. Nell held it. "Touch this line and she bolts. She'll hit the far rail at speed. Do you want to explain to the Duke why his mare has a broken leg?" Thomas looked at Fenton. Fenton looked at Nell. The cherry blossom petals drifted across the training ring like a slow, pink argument. "The girl thinks she knows better than 15 years of stable management," Fenton said to no one in particular. "The girl knows this mare," Nell said, "and this mare knows me. That is the entire science of training. If you'd like a demonstration, you're welcome to stand there. If you'd like to help, you can fetch her a bucket of water. She's overheated." The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. Thomas retreated. The grooms retreated. Fenton stood at the rail, his thick fingers wrapped around the top bar, and watched Nell work the mare for another 20 minutes. She did not look at him once. When she was finished, the mare was walking calmly, her ears forward, her breathing even. Nell led the mare past Fenton without a word. She felt his stare on her back like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades, and she kept walking. That evening, after she had watered and fed and checked the hooves of every horse in her care, Nell went looking for Kit. She found him in the hayloft above the east stable, sitting cross-legged on a horse blanket with a book in his hands. The light came through the high window in a golden slant, the last of the spring afternoon, and caught the dust motes drifting above his dark hair. He was reading intently, his brow furrowed, one finger tracing a line on the page. He did not hear her climb the ladder. Nell paused at the top, her elbows on the loft floor, and tilted her head to read the spine of his book. She could not see the title, but the text on the open page was not English. "Is that Latin?" she said. Kit startled. The book snapped shut, a reflex so fast it spoke of years of practice, and he shoved it beneath the horse blanket. His face, which had been open and absorbed, closed like a door. No. It was. Nell climbed the rest of the way up and sat on a hay bale opposite him. She pulled a piece of straw from the bale and chewed the end of it. I can't read Latin, but I can recognize it. My father had a book on cattle diseases. Very dull, very Latin. She watched him. Where did you learn? Nowhere. Nowhere, of course. She tilted her head, studying the way he held the hidden book beneath the blanket, protectively, the way you would hold a letter from someone you loved. You know, for a stable boy, you have very interesting reading habits. For a horse trainer, you have very interesting surveillance habits. She grinned. The expression surprised him. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped a fraction, as if he had braced for anger and found something else instead. Nell Prescott's grin was not a polite thing. It was wide and slightly crooked, and it showed too many teeth, and it made her look, according to her late mother, like a fox who had found the henhouse unlocked. Fair point, she said. I'll stop spying if you tell me what you're reading. De Re Equestria. He said it before he could stop himself. She could see the words escape and the regret follow, a half-second behind, like a man chasing a hat in the wind. Horse anatomy, in Latin. It is a foundational text on equine medicine and training. In Latin. Yes. Which you learned nowhere. Kit looked at her. His grey-green eyes held something that might have been humor, if humor were a language he had mostly forgotten. You are very persistent. I have been told, usually right before being asked to leave. Nell stood, brushed hay from her skirt, and paused at the top of the ladder. Fenton hits you often? The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Kit's face went carefully blank, the blankness of someone who has practiced neutrality the way other people practice music. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. I don't like watching people get struck. Then don't watch. She looked at him for a long moment, and his broad shoulders, his calloused hands, the faint bruise already darkening on his jaw. A stable boy who read veterinary texts in Latin and responded to violence with the stillness of a man managing something far more dangerous than anger. Good night, Kit. Good night, Miss Prescott. Nell. A pause. Nell. She climbed down the ladder and walked across the stable yard in the cooling spring air, cherry blossoms catching in her hair, and thought, something is wrong here. Something about that boy does not fit. Behind her, in the hayloft, she had the soft rustle of a book being retrieved from beneath a blanket. She learned about Domine on her third day. Thomas, the sandy-haired groom, told her while they were mucking out the east stable. He spoke in the hushed, slightly awed tone people reserve for natural disasters and very large animals. The Duke's Stallion. Black. 17 hands. Nobody rides him. Nobody can. He threw Lord Whitmore last autumn, broke his collarbone in 2 places. Before that, he kicked a groom so hard the man couldn't walk right for 3 months. Thomas leaned on his pitchfork. Fenton keeps him in the back paddock because even the other horses are afraid of him. Has anyone tried to train him properly? Thomas looked at her as if she had suggested training a thunderstorm. Miss Prescott, that horse is not trainable. He's wrong, somehow. Like something broke in him, and nobody knows how to fix it. Nell went to see. The back paddock was separated from the main stable yard by a stone wall and a gate that was bolted, chained, and had a sign nailed to it that read, "Keep clear," in letters so emphatic they might have been written in the aftermath of someone's broken ribs. Nell climbed the gate. Domine stood in the far corner of the paddock, beneath a hawthorn tree that was just beginning to flower. He was magnificent. Not beautiful. Beautiful was too tame a word. He was a force contained in the shape of a horse, black as coal dust, his coat catching the spring sunlight in blue-black ripples, his muscles bunched beneath his skin like coiled rope. His mane was long and tangled, and his eyes, when he turned them on Nell, were wild. She stood very still. Dominé's head came up. His nostrils flared. He pawed the ground once, twice, and then charged. He covered the distance between them in seconds, his hooves tearing the spring grass, and Nell had approximately one heartbeat in which to decide whether to run or stand. She stood. Her fingers gripped the top bar of the gate behind her, her knees locked. The stallion came at her like a black wave, and stopped. Stopped dead 3 feet away, his breath hot on her face, his eyes rolling. "Hello," Nell said. Her voice shook. She did not try to hide it. "You're very large." Dominé screamed. The sound, half whinny, half something older and more furious, echoed off the stable walls. He reared, his front hooves slashing the air above Nell's head, and she pressed her back against the gate and thought, with the peculiar clarity of the genuinely terrified, "This is how I find out if I'm brave or merely reckless." "Easy." The voice came from behind her, low, quiet, almost a whisper, but with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "Easy, boy. Down." Dominé's hooves hit the ground. His ears, which had been flat against his skull, pricked forward. He turned his massive head toward the voice, and Nell, her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her teeth, turned too. Kit stood at the gate. He had climbed it soundlessly, or she had been too focused on the 17-hand stallion trying to cave in her skull to hear him. He reached over the rail and laid his hand, palm flat, on Dominé's neck. The horse, the unkillable, unrideable, ungovernable beast that had broken Lord Whitmore's collarbone and terrorized every groom at Thornfield, pressed his nose into Kit's chest and exhaled. A long, shuddering breath. The tension drained out of the animal like water from a cracked cup. Dominé's eyes half closed. He lipped at Kit's shirt collar. He was, Nell realized with a shock that bordered on the physical, nuzzling. "How?" she managed. Kit's hand moved in slow circles on the stallion's neck. His face, so often guarded and closed, was unguarded now, open in a way she had not seen before, as if touching this horse unlocked something in him that the rest of the world kept bolted shut. "He knows me," Kit said. "He knows you." Nell pushed herself off the gate. Her legs were trembling. "That horse just tried to flatten me, and he's leaning on you like a puppy." "He was frightened. You startled him." "I startled him. He charged me." "He charges everyone. It's a test. If you run, he knows you're not worth trusting." Kit looked at her, and something flickered across his face. Not quite admiration, not quite concern. "You didn't run." "I was too scared to run. There's a difference." "Not to him." They stood in the spring paddock, the hawthorn tree dropping its white blossoms around them, and Nell watched Kit speak to the stallion in a voice so low she could barely hear the words. His hands moved with the slow, certain gentleness of someone who understood not just horses, but the specific architecture of this horse's fear. Dominé's breathing slowed, his muscles unclenched. He stood quietly, his great dark head resting against Kit's shoulder. A second contradiction. Stable boys did not read equine anatomy in Latin. They did not calm untamable stallions with a whisper and a touch. They did not hold themselves with that careful, educated stillness that spoke of lessons learned in rooms with polished floors and tall windows. Something is very wrong here, Nell thought again. And this time, the thought felt less like curiosity and more like the edge of something she was not yet ready to name. She could not sleep that night. The groom's quarters were above the west stable. Fenton had given her a narrow room with a window that overlooked the back paddock and a bed that smelled of hay and old saddle leather. She lay in the dark, listening to the spring peepers in the pond beyond the garden wall, and thought about Kit's hands on Dominé's neck. At midnight, she got up. She told herself she was checking on the horses. She told herself this even as she pulled on her boots and her coat and crossed the stable yard, even as she climbed the stone wall at the edge of the back paddock, even as she settled herself on the top rail of the fence and looked out into the moonlit field. She told herself this right up until the moment she saw him. Kit was riding Domine. The moonlight turned the paddock silver. Silver grass, silver hawthorn, silver apple blossoms from the orchard beyond the wall. Kit sat in the saddle as if he had been born there, his back straight, his hands light on the reins, his body moving with the horse in a rhythm so fluid it looked like a single creature. He rode Domine in a wide arc across the paddock, the stallion's hooves barely audible on the soft spring earth, and then he turned, tight, collected, elegant, and brought the horse to a canter along the far fence. Nell's chest tightened. He did not ride like a stable boy. She had grown up around stable boys, had watched them mount and dismount and trot and lumber around exercise rings her entire life. They rode with competence. Some rode with skill. None of them rode like this. Kit rode like a gentleman, like a man who had been taught by someone who understood that riding was not about control, but about conversation, a negotiation between two bodies moving through space. His seat was flawless. His posture was the kind that came from years of instruction, not from hauling hay bales and exercising hacks. She watched him for, she didn't know how long. Minutes, maybe longer. The spring night was cool and smelled of jasmine from the garden wall, and the moonlight caught the line of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, and she felt something shift inside her chest. A door opening into a room she had not known was there. He saw her. He pulled Domine up mid-gallop, the stallion sliding to a halt on his haunches, and turned. Across the moonlit field, Nell sat on the fence rail, her coat pulled tight around her, her auburn hair loose on her shoulders. And Kit sat on the Duke's untamable horse, and they stared at each other. The night-blooming jasmine released its scent into the cool air. A fox called somewhere in the far woods. Domine stamped, impatient, and Kit laid a hand on his neck without looking away from her. Nell did not speak. She could not think of a single word that was adequate to the distance between what she was seeing and what she understood. Kit held her gaze for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5. And then he turned Domine, quietly, and rode into the shadow of the hawthorn tree, and was gone. Nell sat on the fence in the moonlight, her hands gripping the rail, and breathed. Something is very wrong here became something is very dangerous here. And the danger, she understood with absolute clarity, had nothing to do with the horse. Over the days that followed, she gathered contradictions the way other people gathered wildflowers, with increasing speed and diminishing caution. Monday. Kit corrected Thomas's method of applying a poultice to a gelding's hock, using terminology Nell had only ever heard from a veterinary surgeon in London. When she raised an eyebrow, he shrugged and said, "Common knowledge." It is not common knowledge. It is extremely uncommon knowledge. It is the kind of knowledge that lives in expensive books behind locked glass in university libraries. Then perhaps I broke into a university library. In your spare time, between mucking stalls, I'm a man of diverse interests. Tuesday. She caught him adjusting the angle of a horseshoe before the farrier arrived, filing the edge with a precision that made the farrier, a 60-year-old man who had shod horses since before Kit was born, blink and say, "Who taught you that?" Kit disappeared before the question required an answer. Wednesday. Pepper escaped. Pepper was, technically, a goat. He was also, Nell suspected, a small agent of chaos sent by a universe that enjoyed watching her lose arguments with livestock. He was old, grey, stubborn, and had a talent for escaping any enclosure built by human hands. On Wednesday morning, Nell opened the tackroom door and found Pepper standing on the saddle bench, chewing a bridle. "No," Nell said. Pepper looked at her with the flat, ancient contempt that only goats can achieve. That is a 15-guinea bridle. Pepper chewed. Get down, right now, I mean it. Pepper did not get down. Pepper continued chewing. When Nell advanced on him, he leaped from the saddle bench to the floor, skidded on the flagstones, knocked over a bucket of hoof oil, and bolted between her legs into the stable yard, trailing the bridle behind him like a grotesque bridal train. Nell chased him. She chased him past the training ring, past the water trough, past 3 grooms who were laughing too hard to help, and around the corner of the feed store, where Pepper, with the unerring instinct of an animal determined to make her look ridiculous, ran directly into Kit's legs and stopped. Kit picked up the goat. He held Pepper against his chest with one arm, the animal's legs dangling, his expression one of profound indignation, and looked at Nell, who was red-faced, out of breath, and had hoof oil on her skirt. Yours? Kit asked. No, absolutely not. That goat is not mine. That goat is a menace to society, and I refuse to take responsibility for... Pepper bleated and settled against Kit's chest, tucking his head under Kit's chin. He seems to think he's yours, Kit said. He is wrong. Kit almost smiled again. That half lift of the mouth, that rusty mechanism. And Nell, despite everything, despite the hoof oil and the stolen bridle and the 3 grooms still laughing behind the water trough, found herself smiling back. A real smile, the kind that starts in the chest and works its way up. For someone who learned Latin nowhere, she said, catching her breath, you have very specific opinions about hoof angles. For someone who isn't responsible for that goat, he replied, you seem to know his escape routes very well. They stood in the spring sunshine, the cherry blossoms drifting, the stolen bridle lying in the mud between them, and for a moment, just a moment, the distance between them was not the distance between a horse trainer and a stable boy. It was the distance between 2 people who were beginning to recognize something in each other that neither of them was ready to name. Kit set Pepper down. The goat trotted immediately to Nell's side and stood there, pressing his bony head against her knee. I believe, Kit said, that you have been chosen. I have been cursed. But her hand, without her permission, dropped to Pepper's head and scratched behind one ragged ear. That evening, after the horses were settled and the grooms had gone to their quarters, Nell went to the estate office. She was looking for the training records. Fenton was supposed to have been keeping logs of each horse's exercise regimen, feed changes, and farrier visits. The steward had mentioned them in his hiring letter. The office was unlocked. The desk was covered in papers, invoices, receipts, letters from feed suppliers. Mel found the training logs in a drawer, but as she pulled them out, a leather-bound ledger fell from behind them and hit the floor, its pages splaying open. She picked it up. The entries were in Fenton's hand. She recognized the cramped, aggressive script from the notes he left in the stable. Columns of numbers, dates, amounts. She was not an accountant, but she had grown up watching her father manage a farm's finances, and she knew what a discrepancy looked like the way a farrier knows what a loose shoe sounds like. The numbers did not add up. Feed costs listed at double the market rate. Farrier invoices for horses that had not been shod. Payment entries to grooms who did not exist. Nell closed the ledger. She held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the physical weight, and the other weight, the kind that settles in your stomach when you realize you have found something that someone does not want found. She put it back exactly where it had fallen. She climbed to her room, locked her door, and sat on her bed in the dark, listening to Pepper bleat softly from the pen below her window. The spring night was warm. The jasmine was blooming, and somewhere in the Thornfield stables, a head groom was stealing from the estate, and a stable boy was reading Latin by moonlight. And Nell Prescott, who had a talent for walking into fires she had not set, was holding the match. The locket changed everything. She found it on a Thursday, 2 weeks into her tenure at Thornfield, while reorganizing the tackroom shelves that Fenton's grooms had allowed to devolve into chaos. Behind a stack of saddle blankets, wedged into the gap between the shelf and the wall as if someone had hidden it, or as if it had fallen and no one had cared enough to retrieve it. Her fingers closed around something small and cold and metal. A locket. Silver, tarnished with age, its chain broken. Nell rubbed the surface with her thumb, and a crest appeared beneath the grime. She did not recognize it, but it was clearly a family coat of arms, finely engraved, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of money and lineage, and a world far above the stable yard. She opened it. Inside, on the left, was a miniature portrait. A young man, dark-haired, grey-eyed, with high cheekbones and a jaw that could have been carved from stone. He wore a riding coat and a cravat, and the expression of someone who was trying to look serious for the painter, but whose eyes were laughing. Nell's breath stopped. She knew that face. Not the man in the portrait. She had never seen him before. But the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the particular angle of the cheekbones. She had seen those features every day for 2 weeks, on a face that was younger and thinner and marked with a bruise that never quite faded before the next one appeared. The man in the locket looked exactly like Kit. Beneath the portrait, in tiny engraved letters, were 2 words: Edmund Ashford. Nell climbed to the hayloft. Kit was there. Of course he was there. It was evening, and the hayloft was the only place in Thornfield where he seemed to breathe without measuring each breath first. He was sitting on his horse blanket, the Latin book open on his knees, and the golden light of the setting sun caught the angles of his face and made him look, for one disorienting moment, exactly like the portrait in her hand. "Who are you?" Mel said. Kit looked up. His eyes went to the locket in her hand, and something happened to his face. Something catastrophic and silent, like a building collapsing inward, all the walls falling at once, but the facade holding for 1 more second. "Where did you find that?" His voice was very quiet. "In the tack room, behind the shelves." She sat down across from him, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and held the locket between them. "This is you. This face. The man in this portrait. He could be your twin." "He was my father." The words dropped into the silence of the hayloft like stones into water. Mel felt them land in her chest. "Your father?" "Lord Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Thornfield's younger brother." Kit closed his book. His hands, those wide, gentle, calloused hands, were shaking. He pressed them flat against his knees. "He died when I was 12, thrown from a horse. They said, Fenton said, he died in disgrace. Debts, a scandal. I don't know the details. I was never told the details." "Kit," she leaned forward. "If your father was Lord Edmund Ashford, then you are—" "Christopher. Christopher Ashford." He said the name as if it belonged to someone else, someone he had known once and lost. "Fenton took me the night my father died. Told the Duke I had been sent away, to relatives, to a school, somewhere. Told me my identity didn't matter, that the Ashford name was ruined, that no one wanted a disgraced lord's son, that I would be better off as nobody." His jaw tightened. "I was 12. I believed him." "You've been a servant in your own family's house for 10 years. "Yes." "Your uncle is the Duke whose horse you ride in secret, the Duke who doesn't know you exist." "He thinks I died. Fenton told him I died." Nell stood up. She did not mean to, but her body was already moving, already pacing, already doing what her body always did when the inside of her head was on fire. She walked to the window and back. She pulled a piece of straw from the bale and broke it. She turned on him. "Why? Why didn't you tell anyone? Write a letter. Walk to the front door of this house and say, 'I am your nephew. I am alive. Your head groom has been lying to you for a decade.'" Kit looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Raw, exhausted, stripped of every defense. "Who would believe me? I have no proof, no papers. The locket, I thought I had lost the locket years ago. Fenton took everything when my father died. Every document, every letter, every piece of evidence. He controls the stables. He controls the accounts. He controls who sees the Duke and who doesn't. His voice cracked, very slightly, on the last word. Who would believe the useless stable boy? The title. The words they called him, the name they had given him, to replace the name they had stolen. Nell sat down again. She sat so close that her knee pressed against his, and she did not move it, and he did not move his. I believe you, she said. Kit looked at her hand on the locket. He looked at her knee against his. He looked at her face and his eyes. Edmund Ashford's eyes, the Duke's brother's eyes, were bright with something he was trying very hard not to feel. That, he said, may be the most dangerous thing you've ever done. I do dangerous things before breakfast. She did not smile. Not this time. Fenton is embezzling from the estate. I found the ledger. The numbers are fabricated. False invoices, phantom staff, doubled costs. He's been stealing for years. Kit's expression shifted. The vulnerability closed, replaced by something harder, more focused. You found the ledger. It fell out of a drawer, literally fell into my lap. The universe is not subtle. She gripped the locket. Kit, Christopher, whoever you are, this is evidence. The ledger and the locket together. If we bring this to the Duke— No. The word was immediate. You don't understand what Fenton will do. I understand exactly what he'll do. He'll deny it. He'll try to have us dismissed. He'll threaten and bluster and call us liars. And then the Duke will look at your face, and he will see his brother, and Fenton will be finished. Kit stared at her. In the golden light, with the dust motes drifting between them and the scent of hay and old leather thick in the air, he looked, for the first time since she had known him, afraid. Not for himself. For her. If Fenton finds out you know, then we'd better be fast. Nell held the locket out to him. This is yours. It was always yours. He took it. His fingers closed around it, and he held it the way he held his Latin book, like a letter from someone he loved. You are, he said slowly, the most reckless person I have ever met. I prefer decisive. You would. She grinned, that fox in the henhouse grin, all teeth and reckless joy. And Kit, for the first time since she had known him, smiled. A real smile. Not the rusty half-lift, not the almost. A full, unguarded smile that transformed his face from striking to beautiful, and made Nell's chest do something complicated and inconvenient that she would think about later, when she was alone, when she could afford to be honest about what it meant. They met in the hayloft at night. It became their war room, their conspiracy, their secret. Nell brought the ledger on the second night, having retrieved it from Fenton's office while Fenton was in the village drinking the profits of his embezzlement. Kit brought candles and a blanket, and the careful, methodical mind of someone who had survived a decade by paying attention to every detail. They spread the ledger on the floor between them, and the candlelight made their shadows huge on the sloping walls, and the rain drummed on the roof above them. Spring rain, soft and persistent, the kind that makes the world feel small and close. Here, Kit said, his finger tracing a column of figures. Feed purchases. He's listing oats at 12 shillings a bushel. The market rate is 6. He's been doubling every feed cost for, look, 3 years at least. And here, Nell leaned over the ledger, and her shoulder pressed against his, and neither of them moved. Farrier invoices for horses that were sold 2 years ago. He's billing the estate for shoes on horses that don't exist. Phantom horses. Kit's mouth twitched. My uncle is paying for ghost horses to be shod with invisible shoes. By an imaginary farrier. One wonders if the imaginary farrier is also overcharging. Nell laughed. A real laugh. The kind that escaped before she could catch it. and Kit looked at her with an expression that stopped her breath. Not the careful blankness, not the guarded assessment. He looked at her with open, startled wonder, as if her laugh were a sound he had forgotten existed. Their hands touched over a page. Nell's fingers landed on the same line his had been tracing. A payment entry for a groom named J. Harker, who, Kit confirmed, had never existed. Their fingers overlapped. Nell's skin registered the warmth of his, the calluses, the width of his hand against hers. She did not pull away. Kit looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face. The rain drummed overhead. The candle flickered. And Kit, Christopher Ashford, the Duke's forgotten nephew, the boy they called useless, forgot what he was saying. The next entry, he said, after a pause that lasted several seconds too long to be about ledgers. The next entry is interesting? Relevant. But his voice had changed, dropped. The word came out rough, as if it had been dragged across gravel. Nell removed her hand. Not quickly. She was not going to pretend that moment had not happened, but deliberately, with the consciousness of someone deciding to delay a conversation they were not yet ready to have. "Show me," she said. Kit cleared his throat. Showed her. They worked until the rain stopped and the first grey light of dawn crept through the hayloft window. And when Nell climbed down the ladder, her fingers smelled of old ink and candle wax and the faint, warm scent of Kit's hands, and she carried that scent back to her room like a secret. The next night, she brought food. Bread from the kitchen, cheese from the larder, a bottle of wine she had charmed out of the cook by complimenting her pastry. Kit looked at the spread she laid out on the horse blanket and raised an eyebrow. Is this a siege provision or a picnic? It is sustenance for the conspiratorially minded. Nell uncorked the wine with her teeth, a skill she had learned from her father and had been told repeatedly was not ladylike. We can't overthrow a corrupt groom on empty stomachs. Kit took the wine. Their fingers brushed on the bottle. He drank, and she watched the movement of his throat. And then she looked away, because watching the movement of his throat was the kind of thing that led to thoughts she could not afford. Tell me about before, she said. Before Fenton. Before all of this. Kit set the wine down. He picked up a piece of bread and did not eat it. He held it in his hands the way he held everything, gently, carefully, as if he were always aware of how easy it was to break things. My father taught me to ride. In this paddock, the same paddock where Domine lives now. I was 5, 6 years old. My father would put me on the oldest, gentlest horse in the stable and walk beside me, one hand on the bridle, telling me stories about every horse he had ever loved. Kit's voice was steady, but his hands were not. He broke the bread in half without looking at it. Domine was his last horse. A foal when he died. Nobody else could handle him. Fenton wanted to sell him, but my uncle, the Duke, refused. Said the horse was all he had left of his brother. And you raised him? In secret, at night. I was the only one who could get close to him. Because... Kit stopped. The candle flames swayed between them. Because I think he remembered. Foals remember the first voice they hear. My father spoke to him on the night he was born. And I sound like my father. Nell set down her wine. Kit, I know. You have been raising your dead father's horse in secret for 10 years, and you still think you're nobody. He looked at her. The candlelight carved shadows beneath his cheekbones and turned his grey-green eyes dark. And Nell saw, clearly, painfully, like stepping into bright sunlight, the boy who had been told his name was worthless, and the man who had almost believed it. My father died owing money to half the county, Kit said. That is what Fenton told me, that my name was a liability, that revealing it would bring shame on the Duke, that I was better off invisible. And you believed him. I was 12. You're not 12 anymore. Silence. The rain had returned, gentle, insistent, and it pattered on the roof above them like quiet applause. Kit looked at the locket in his hand. He turned it over, running his thumb across the engraved crest. I know, he said again, quieter this time, honest. Nell told him about the farm. She had not planned to. The wine helped, and the darkness, and the particular intimacy of a hayloft in the rain. But once she started, the words came out with the force of something that had been pressed down too long. My father bred horses. Good horses, not fancy, not aristocratic, but strong and honest and well-trained. He was the best horseman I ever knew. She pulled her knees to her chest. He died 4 years ago. Left debts I didn't know about. The farm was auctioned. I stood in the kitchen, my mother's kitchen, and watched strangers walk through it, opening her cupboards, touching her china, pricing everything. Her voice did not break. She would not let it. They priced her rolling pin at 6pence. She made bread with that rolling pin every morning for 20 years. Kit set down the bread he had not eaten. He did not reach for her. He did not offer comfort. He sat very still and listened with his whole body, shoulders angled toward her, head slightly bent, hands open on his knees. And Nell thought, he knows. He knows what it is to watch your life be taken from you by people who do not understand its value. That is why you need this position, Kit said, not a question. If Fenton has me dismissed, I have nowhere to go. No family, no references. The last 3 employers found me too opinionated. Thornfield is everything. Yes. The word hung between them. Kit reached across the space that separated them and placed the locket on the blanket between his knee and hers. A bridge, an offering. Then we'll be careful, he said. A sound from below, a scrabbling, scraping, indignant sound, and Pepper's head appeared at the top of the hayloft ladder. The goat hauled himself up the last rung with the determination of a mountaineer summiting a difficult peak, trotted across the straw-strewn floor, and lay down between them, pressing his bony spine against Nell's thigh and his stubby horns against Kit's knee. Kit looked at the goat. Nell looked at the goat. How, Kit said, did he climb a ladder? I have stopped asking how he does anything. He operates outside the natural laws. Mel scratched Pepper's ears. The goat sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of satisfaction. He once opened a latched gate, crossed an entire stable yard, and let himself into the feed store. He ate 6 pounds of oats and fell asleep in a hay net. Impressive. Criminal. Kit's hand, almost absently, dropped to Pepper's back. His fingers brushed Nell's where they rested on the goat's grey fur. Neither of them moved. The rain drummed, the candle burned lower, and the 2 of them sat in the hayloft with a stolen goat and a stolen ledger and a locket that held the face of a dead lord, and the distance between them was the width of an old goat's spine. And it was not enough. And it was too much. And they both knew it. The Duke announced the spring exhibition on a Monday. Mel heard about it from Thomas, who heard it from the butler, who heard it from the Duke himself. The old man had emerged from his private rooms for the first time in months, shuffling through the great hall with a cane and a grief that had calcified into something resembling stone. An equestrian exhibition, Thomas said, bouncing on his heels with excitement. The spring fair, all the local gentry. Fenton's to present the horses. His big moment, he says. Been planning it for weeks. Nell went to the hayloft that evening. Kit was already there, the locket around his neck on a new chain she had bought in the village. The spring exhibition, she said, sitting down opposite him. Fenton presents the horses. The Duke watches from the balcony. Every gentleman in the county attends. I know. You ride Domine? Kit's head came up. No. You ride Domine in front of the Duke, in front of everyone. They see you on that horse. They see the way you ride. And the Duke will know. He will look at you and see his brother. No, this is the chance, the only chance. The ledger is evidence, but evidence can be denied. Ledgers can be burned, but you on that horse, with your father's face and your father's seat and your father's locket around your neck, that cannot be denied. Kit stood. He walked to the window, 4 steps in the narrow loft, and stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid beneath his shirt. The spring evening light came through the window and silhouetted him, and Nell saw, in the set of his spine and the tension in his hands, the war between the boy who had survived by being invisible and the man who was tired of hiding. "I've survived 10 years by being invisible," he said to the window. "You haven't survived." Nell's voice was quiet, not gentle. She was not capable of gentleness when she was telling a truth that someone needed to hear. "You've been buried alive." He turned. His face was... She could not look at his face. She looked anyway. It was the face of a man hearing, for the first time, the thing he had been telling himself in the dark for years, spoken aloud by someone who meant it. "If it goes wrong," he began, "then it goes wrong, and we deal with it, together." He looked at her for a long time. The locket glinted at his throat. Domine whinnied from the paddock below, a distant, impatient sound, as if the horse knew what they were discussing and had opinions about it. "Together," Kit repeated. The word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, like a language he had once spoken and was only now remembering. But Fenton moved first. He found Nell in the stable yard 2 days before the exhibition, when the other grooms were at supper and the yard was empty. He came around the corner of the feed store and blocked her path. Not dramatically, not with menace. Simply stood there, filling the space between the buildings with his bulk and his cold eyes and his scarred hands. "You've been asking questions," he said. His voice was conversational, pleasant even. "About the accounts." Nell's hand found the stable wall behind her. She held it. "I've been reviewing the training records. As the Duke's horse trainer, I have access. You have access to what I decide you have access to." Fenton stepped closer, not close enough to touch. He was too smart for that. Close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and the horse sweat on his coat. "Let me explain something to you, Miss Prescott. This estate has run smoothly for 15 years. The Duke is old. He is tired. He does not want complications. And you, with your questions and your ledgers and your midnight visits to the hayloft, you are a complication." "Are you threatening me?" "I am advising you, as a colleague." His smile was thin. "If you continue asking questions, I will have you dismissed, without a reference. And then I will tell the Duke that Kit, your stable boy, your little project, has been stealing feed from the stores. I have witnesses who will say whatever I tell them to say." He leaned forward. "Do you understand?" Nell understood. She understood with perfect, crystalline clarity, and she understood that Fenton was a man who had been lying for so long that he had forgotten what truth looked like. And she understood that she was afraid. And she understood that her fear did not matter. "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "Perfectly." Fenton nodded, stepped back, walked away. Nell stood in the empty stable yard, her back against the wall, her heart slamming against her ribs, and felt the familiar heat of a decision already made. The decision that preceded thought, that lived in her body before it reached her mind. She was not going to stop. She found Kit in the paddock, brushing Domine's mane in the twilight. The stallion's coat gleamed like black water in the fading light, and Kit's hands moved in long, steady strokes. and there was a peace in the picture that made what she had to tell him worse. "Fenton knows," she said. Kit's hand stopped. Domine turned his great head and looked at Nell with dark, liquid eyes. "He threatened me, said he'd have me dismissed and frame you for theft." She came closer, leaned against the paddock fence. "Kit, he will do it. He'll wait until after the exhibition, when the Duke is pleased with the horses and grateful to Fenton. And then he'll move. We don't have time to be careful anymore." Kit set down the brush. He turned to face her, and the twilight carved his face into hard planes. The jaw, the cheekbones, the grey-green eyes that were Edmund Ashford's eyes, that were the Thornfield bloodline written in skin and bone. "If he touches your position," Kit said. His voice was different, low and tight, and vibrating with something she had never heard from him before. Not anger, not fear, but a controlled fury that came from somewhere deeper than either. "If he touches your position, I will ride that horse in front of every person in this county. And you know what they'll see." "Kit, he knows." Kit gripped the fence rail. His knuckles were white. "He's always known. That's why he kept me here. That's why he made me invisible. Because if anyone looks at me, really looks, they see Edmund Ashford's son. And then every lie he's told for 10 years comes apart." Nell reached across the fence and put her hand over his. His fingers were cold and rigid and trembling, and she held them the way you hold a match, carefully, because the flame was fragile and necessary. "Then let them look," she said. The morning of the spring fair dawned clear and warm, the sky the particular blue that April reserves for days of consequence. Cherry blossoms drifted across the Thornfield estate like pink confetti, settling on the stone walls, the gravel paths, the bunting that the household staff had strung between the stable blocks. The gentry arrived in carriages, landaus and barouches, and one ancient phaeton that looked as if it had been built during the previous king's reign. Ladies in muslin and gentlemen in riding coats filled the stands that had been erected beside the exhibition ring, their voices carrying across the yard in the bright spring air. The Duke watched from the balcony above the stable courtyard. He sat in a high-backed chair, a blanket across his knees despite the warmth, his white hair thin and his face grey, and his hands, those Ashford hands, the same wide, strong hands that Kit had inherited, gripping the arms of his chair as if holding himself upright required conscious effort. He had not visited the stables in 3 years. He had not watched a horse exhibition since his brother died. Fenton was in his element. He had dressed in his best coat, polished his boots, oiled his hair. He presented the horses one by one. The bay mare Nell had trained, now moving in perfect circles. A pair of matched greys, a chestnut hunter, with a stride like a metronome. Each presentation was smooth, professional, practiced. The gentry applauded. The Duke nodded from his balcony. Nell stood at the edge of the ring, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She wore a clean dress, the only clean dress she owned, dark green, with her auburn hair pinned up and her mother's brooch at her throat. In the pocket of her dress, folded into a tight square, was the list of discrepancies from Fenton's ledger. She had copied them by hand. She had checked them twice. The last horse was presented. Fenton took his bow. The gentry began to clap. And then, Kit led Domine out. The stallion came through the stable doors like a thunderhead breaking over a mountain, black, massive, his hooves striking the cobblestones with a sound that silenced the applause mid-beat. His mane had been brushed until it gleamed. His coat shone like midnight silk. He was, in that moment, the most magnificent animal that any of them had ever seen, and the sound that went through the crowd was not a gasp, but a collective intake of breath. The sound of 100 people remembering, simultaneously, that beauty could be terrifying. Fenton's face went white. He stepped forward. "That horse is not part of the—" Kit mounted. He swung into the saddle in a single motion, fluid, effortless. The kind of mount that spoke of 10,000 hours of practice, of a body that knew the language of horses the way other bodies knew walking. Domine stood still beneath him, not controlled, not restrained. Still, the way a river is still before it falls. Waiting. Kit looked at the balcony. The Duke looked down. And then Kit rode. He took Domine across the ring at a walk, then a trot, then a canter, each transition seamless, each movement a conversation between man and horse that the audience could see but not hear. He rode the way his father had ridden, not with the stiff formality of a trained equestrian, but with the fluid grace of someone for whom riding was not a skill, but an extension of self. His back was straight, his hands were light. His face, in the spring sunlight, was Edmund Ashford's face, younger, leaner, marked by years of labor and silence, but unmistakable. Every groom stopped. Every gentry member leaned forward. The Duke's hand gripped the railing of the balcony. His face, already grey, drained of what little colour remained. His mouth opened. His eyes, the same grey-green eyes that Kit had, that Edmund had had, that every Ashford since the first Duke had carried like a family seal, widened. "Edmund," he whispered. Then louder, his voice cracking like old timber. "That is not Edmund. That is his son." The silence that followed was absolute. It lasted 3 heartbeats. Nell counted them, her own heart marking time. And then it shattered into a chaos of voices, of chairs scraping, of people standing and pointing and saying the Ashford name in tones that ranged from shock to recognition, to the particular breathless excitement of people who have just witnessed something that will become a story told for decades. Kit brought Domine to a halt in the center of the ring. The stallion stood like a statue, his breath steaming faintly in the cool spring air. Kit sat in the saddle and looked at his uncle, and the Duke looked at him, and between them stretched 10 years of silence and lies, and a grief so deep it had become geography. Fenton moved. He crossed the ring toward Kit, his face mottled with fury, his hands clenched at his sides. "This boy is a stable hand. He has no right to. Bring him to me." The Duke's voice, from the balcony, carried across the yard with an authority that Fenton's never had. The authority of blood, of title, of a man who had spent 50 years being obeyed. "Bring that boy to me. Now." Nell stepped into the ring. She walked to Kit's side, reached up, and handed him the locket. He looked at it in his palm, his father's face, his family's crest. And then he dismounted and walked toward the entrance that led up to the balcony, Domine following behind him like a dog. The Duke's study was panelled in oak and smelled of old books and cold tea. Nell stood beside Kit, her hand in her pocket, gripping the list of discrepancies, and watched the Duke of Thornfield look at his nephew for the first time in 10 years. The old man was standing. He had hauled himself out of his chair with the aid of his cane and his butler, and he stood now with his weight on the cane, and his eyes on Kit's face and an expression that Nell could barely look at. Grief. Recognition. The particular agony of a man who has been mourning someone who was alive the entire time. "Fenton told me you were dead," the Duke said. His voice was barely audible. "He told me. He said you had been sent to a school, and then he said there was an illness." "There was no illness," Kit said. "There was no school. I have been in your stables for 10 years. The Duke closed his eyes. Nell pulled the ledger notes from her pocket. "Your Grace, I also have evidence that Mr. Fenton has been embezzling from the estate. Falsified invoices, phantom staff, doubled costs. For at least 3 years, though I suspect longer." The Duke opened his eyes. He looked at the papers. He looked at Fenton, who had been brought to the study by 2 footmen, and who stood by the door with the face of a man watching the walls close in. "Is this true?" the Duke asked. Fenton opened his mouth, closed it. opened it again. "The boy is lying. He's a stable hand. I took him in. I gave him work. You took my brother's son," the Duke said, and his voice was no longer quiet. "You took my brother's son, and you told me he was dead, and you kept him as a servant in his own family's house, and you stole from me while you did it." Fenton had no answer. There was no answer. The evidence was in Nell's hand, and the proof was in Kit's face, and the truth was so large and so obvious that it filled the room like smoke. "Get out," the Duke said. "Get out of my house. If you are on Thornfield land by morning, I will have you arrested." Fenton left. He walked out of the study and down the corridor and out of the front door of Thornfield Park, and Nell listened to his boots on the marble floor grow fainter and fainter until they were gone. The Duke turned to Kit. Silence. The old man's hand trembled on his cane. His eyes, those Ashford eyes, dimmed by age and grief and years of believing the worst lie he had ever been told, moved across Kit's face with a hunger that was painful to witness. He reached out and touched Kit's cheek. His fingers were cold and papery and shaking. "You have his eyes," the Duke said. Kit broke. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the quiet, devastating collapse of a man who had held himself together for 10 years through sheer force of will. And the sound he made, a single, choked breath, was the most honest thing Nell had ever heard. She left. She walked out of the study and closed the door and stood in the corridor with her back against the wall, and she pressed her hands over her mouth and breathed and did not cry, because she was Nell Prescott, and Nell Prescott did not cry in hallways. She cried later, alone, where no one could see. Pepper was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He butted his head against her shin, and she picked him up and held him, his bony body warm against her chest, and stood in the grand corridor of Thornfield Park and thought, "It is done." But it was not done, because Kit was now Christopher Ashford, and Christopher Ashford was not a stable boy who read Latin in haylofts and fed apples to goats and touched her hand over stolen ledgers in the rain. Christopher Ashford was the Duke of Thornfield's nephew, the heir presumptive, a man who would meet tailors and dancing masters and a seat in Parliament, not a horse trainer with mud on her boots and a talent for trouble. The household learned the truth within hours. By evening, every servant, every groom, every maid knew that the useless stable boy was Lord Edmund's son, that Fenton had been a thief and a liar, that the Duke had wept. The grooms who had kicked Kit's boots and thrown his blankets in the horse trough and laughed when Fenton struck in could not look at him now. They averted their eyes when he passed. Some of them tried to apologize. Kit accepted their apologies with the quiet, careful courtesy of a man who had learned long ago that forgiveness was cheaper than anger. Nell watched all of this from a distance that grew wider by the hour. She found her in the stable that evening, or rather, he found her. She was packing. Not dramatically. Nell did not do things dramatically on purpose. The drama simply followed her like weather. She was folding her spare dress into her trunk and wrapping her father's old riding crop in cloth, and trying not to think about haylofts and candlelight and the warmth of his hands. "Where are you going?" Kit stood in the stable door. He was wearing new clothes. Someone had found him a coat that fit, a clean shirt, boots without holes. And he looked, standing there in the lamplight with his dark hair and his Ashford jaw and his new clothes, like someone she had never met. "You don't need a horse trainer anymore." Nell did not look up from her packing. "You need a tailor, a dancing master, someone to teach you which fork to use at dinner." "I know which fork to use at dinner." "Of course you do. You know everything." She folded the dress too tightly, unfolded it, folded it again. "You're Christopher Ashford. The Duke's nephew. You'll have a title and an estate and a seat in Parliament and a house in London. And you'll marry someone appropriate. Someone who doesn't steal apples and chase goats and make enemies of senior staff on her first day. Now, and that is fine. That is as it should be. You have your life back, and I have a trunk and a goat and very strong opinions about hoof angles. And that is... Nell. She stopped. Her hands were shaking on the folded dress. She gripped the fabric and held on, and did not look at him, because if she looked at him, she would. She didn't know what she would do. Something irreversible. Something wrecker-shaped. Kit crossed the stable. His boots, new boots, polished boots, boots that belonged to an heir, not a groom, stopped in front of her trunk. She stared at them. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. He was holding the locket, not wearing it, holding it, open in his palm. On one side, his father's portrait. On the other side, she had not seen this before, a space where a second portrait should have been. Empty. Waiting. "I am not offering you the heir of Thornfield," Kit said. His voice was rough, not the careful, measured voice of the hayloft, not the quiet, guarded voice of the stable yard. This voice was unpolished and honest, and scared in a way that made her chest ache. "I am not offering you a title or a house or a seat at a table where they argue about forks. I am offering you Kit, the one who reads in haylofts and steals Latin books and talks to horses and cannot say what he means until it is almost too late." Nell's grip on the dress loosened. "I have lived 10 years as nobody," he said. "I was nobody when you stepped between me and Fenton. I was nobody when you sat on a fence in the moonlight and watched me ride. I was nobody when you held the locket in your hands and said, 'I believe you.' You chose nobody. You chose Kit." He closed the locket. "I am still Kit, and I would very much like you to stay." Nell stood there, with her half-packed trunk and her shaking hands, and the goat bleating softly from his pen outside the window. And she thought about kitchens and auctions and sixpenny rolling pins. And she thought about moonlight and Latin, and the weight of a hand over hers on a stolen ledger. And she thought about the word together, how it had sounded in his mouth like a language he was learning. "That," she said, "is the first speech you've ever gotten right." Kit's eyes widened. Hope, fear, the two so close together they were indistinguishable. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "I keep training the horses. I don't become a lady who sits in parlors and does embroidery and talks about weather." "Agreed." "I keep my name, Nell Prescott. I didn't survive this long by becoming someone else." "Agreed." "Pepper stays." "The goat." "The goat stays." "Agreed." She ran out of conditions. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she had seen once before, in the hayloft, when she had laughed and his face had opened like a door, and she was out of conditions and out of defenses and out of reasons to keep folding this dress. She dropped the dress. She crossed the space between them. 2 steps, she counted, the 2 longest steps of her life, and kissed him. Not gently, not tentatively. She kissed him because she was leaving, and because he had asked her to stay, and because the distance between those 2 things, between going and staying, between Kit and Christopher, between the stable yard and the life she could not yet imagine, could only be crossed by an act so reckless and so certain that it left no room for doubt. His hands came up, those wide, calloused, impossibly gentle hands, and cupped her face, and he kissed her back with the desperate precision of a man who had been waiting for permission to want something for 10 years, and had just received it. When they broke apart, Nell's hands were fisted in his coat, the new coat, already wrinkled, and Kit's forehead was pressed against hers, and they were both breathing hard, and she could feel his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt, steady and strong, and faster than she had ever felt it. "For the record," she said, her voice not entirely steady, "I am not doing this because you're the Duke's nephew." "I know." "I am doing this despite you being the Duke's nephew." "I know that too." "Good." She released his coat, smoothed the wrinkle she had made. "Now, about this spring ball I've been hearing about." The spring ball was held that evening in the Thornfield Great Hall, which had been decorated with cherry blossom branches and white candles, and enough flowers to supply a small botanical garden. The gentry who had attended the exhibition returned in evening dress, buzzing with the story of the stable boy and the Duke's horse and the embezzling groom, and the hall hummed with the particular energy of a community that has just acquired its best piece of gossip in a decade. Nell wore a dress. She hated it. It was blue. Someone from the household had found it, altered it, pressed it, and delivered it to her room with a pair of slippers and a set of hairpins, and a note that said, "From the Duke's household, with gratitude." It fit. It was beautiful. It made her feel like a horse wearing a saddle designed for a different species. She stood at the entrance to the great hall, tugging at the waist of the dress the way she would tug at a girth strap, and surveyed the room with the expression of a woman preparing to enter enemy territory. Kit appeared at her side. He was wearing... She looked at him, and her breath did something inconvenient. He was wearing evening clothes. A dark coat, a white cravat. His hair had been combed, and his boots had been polished, and he looked, in the candlelight, like the portrait in the locket brought to life. Handsome, aristocratic, entirely, devastatingly, Kit. "Ready?" he asked. "If anyone asks me about embroidery," Nell said, "I'm climbing out the window. The windows are 15 feet up. I've climbed worse." He offered his arm. She took it. They walked into the great hall together, and the room, every face, every pair of eyes, turned to watch them. The groom's wives curtsied. Nell curtsied back. It was not a good curtsy. It was the curtsy of a woman who had learned the motion from a book and was executing it from memory and muscle reluctance. Her knee went too far down. She wobbled. She recovered. Kit's hand tightened on her arm, not in embarrassment, but in something that felt, through the fabric of his coat, like pride. They danced. Or rather, Kit danced and Nell followed, which was a reversal of every dynamic they had established, and one she found both irritating and, she would admit only privately, thrilling. He moved with the same fluid grace he showed on horseback, that effortless, educated rhythm, and she moved with the determined competence of someone who had practiced 3 times in her room that afternoon, with a broom as a partner. "You're leading," he murmured. "I'm always leading. I've noticed." She smiled, the fox grin, and he smiled back, and they moved through the candle-lit hall with the cherry blossoms drifting past the tall windows, and the gentry watched, and the Duke watched from his chair with tears on his old gray face, and Nell thought, This is what it feels like when the ground shifts beneath your feet and you don't fall." Later, after the music and the wine and the endless introductions to people whose names she would never remember, she stood by the window and watched Kit talk to his uncle. The old Duke held Kit's hand in both of his, and his mouth was moving, and Kit was nodding, and the candlelight made them both glow, the old man and the young man, the uncle and the nephew, the grief and its remedy. Kit looked across the room and found her. His eyes, Edmund Ashford's eyes, the Thornfield eyes, held hers, and the look in them was the kind that needed no translation, no subtext, no careful interpretation. It was the look of a man who would burn down the entire house to keep her, and who would also, she knew, follow her out the window if she decided to climb. She raised her glass to him. He raised his back. Pepper, who had escaped his pen and somehow navigated the servants' entrance, trotted across the great hall floor, ignored the shriek of a duchess, and settled at Nell's feet. "You," Nell said to the goat, "are uninvited." Pepper chewed the hem of her dress. "And that is borrowed." Pepper did not care. Pepper had never cared. Pepper was a force of nature, in the shape of a goat, and Nell, who was a force of nature in the shape of a woman, respected that. 6 months later, autumn came to Thornfield. The cherry blossoms were long gone. The hawthorn had dropped its white flowers and grown heavy with red berries. The hedgerows were gold and bronze, and the fields were stubbled from the harvest, and the morning air had the particular sharpness of October. Not cold yet, but remembering cold, preparing for it. Nell rode in the early morning, the way she rode every morning, before dawn, when the mist still clung to the paddocks, and the only sounds were hoofbeats and birdsong, and the distant bleating of a goat who had, once again, escaped his pen. She rode the bay mare she had trained on her first day at Thornfield, the horse moving beneath her with the easy confidence of an animal who trusted the hands on the reins. Pepper trotted behind them. He was fatter now. The cook had started feeding him kitchen scraps, which Nell officially disapproved of, and unofficially encouraged. And his grey coat was thick with the onset of his winter fleece. He followed Nell everywhere. He slept outside her door. He had once tried to follow her into the Duke's dining room, and been removed by a footman who, Nell suspected, had needed to sit down afterward. She pulled the mare up at the top of the hill and looked down at Thornfield Park. The house spread below her like something from a painting, stone and glass and ivy, the garden still green despite the season, the stable yard busy with grooms and horses. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Somewhere inside, the Duke was having his breakfast, and somewhere in the stables, Christopher Ashford, Kit, always Kit to her, was brushing Domine's mane and talking to the horse in that low, steady voice that the stallion would follow into fire. She turned the mare and rode down the hill, Pepper scrambling behind her, and crossed the stable yard as the sun broke through the mist and turned everything gold. Kit was waiting at the stable door. He leaned against the frame the way he had leaned 1,000 times, shoulders against the wood, arms crossed, that quiet watchfulness that had drawn her in before she understood what she was being drawn toward. The locket hung at his throat. He wore it always now, not hidden beneath his shirt, but visible, the Ashford crest catching the light, his father's portrait inside, and next to it, in the space that had been empty. She dismounted. Her boots hit the cobblestones and she was muddy. She was always muddy. It was practically a condition of her existence, and her hair was escaping its pins, and her cheeks were red from the ride, and she was grinning. The fox grin, all teeth and joy. Kit looked at her with the expression she had come to know as intimately as her own face in the mirror. The look that said, "I cannot believe you are real, and I cannot believe you are mine, and I would like to watch you dismount from horses for the rest of my life." He reached out and brushed something from her hair. His fingers came away with a petal, small, dried, brown at the edges. A cherry blossom petal. But the cherry blossoms were gone. They had been gone since May. "How?" he began. "I saved one." Mel took the petal from his fingers and held it up. "Pressed it. In the locket. Next to your father's portrait." Kit opened the locket. There, on the right side, where his father's portrait faced, not another portrait, not a miniature painting, but a single cherry blossom petal, pressed flat, its pink faded to the color of old rose, fragile as a promise. A spring morning in the stable yard, a crack like a pistol shot. A woman who stepped between a boy and a fist and said, "Touch him again." Kit closed the locket. He pulled her in. Muddy boots, windswept hair, escaped pins, fox grin, all of her, and kissed the top of her head, and held her against his chest. And she stood in the circle of his arms and listened to his heartbeat, and felt, beneath the October sky, the warmth of a spring that had never quite ended. Pepper butted his head against their shins and bleated. Nell looked down at the goat. Kit looked down at the goat. The goat looked up at them with the immortal, unimpressed expression of a creature who had climbed ladders and eaten bridles and crossed grand halls uninvited, and who fully intended to continue doing so for the foreseeable future. "Your goat," Kit said. "Our goat," Nell said. When the morning was gold, and the stable yard smelled of hay and horse and the last of the autumn roses, and somewhere in the house the Duke was laughing for the first time in years, and somewhere in the paddock Domine stood with his head over the fence, waiting for the voice that had always known his name. And Nell Prescott, who had arrived at Thornfield with a trunk and a stolen apple and a talent for trouble, stood in the arms of the man they had called useless, and knew that this was the life she had chosen, and that she would choose it again, every morning, without hesitation, without regret, for as long as there were horses to ride and fires to walk into, and the sound of his heartbeat beneath her ear.